Hello, everybody. I am Brady, also known in some corners of the internet as Warhamster, and with me today is Colonel Towner-Watkins, who I've did a recent show with, and hopefully this is the second of many more to come. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Doing good. Today we've got a fun topic that we both have been researching from different directions, and I think it's going to be really complimentary. But we're going to talk about Robert Maxwell, the father of the currently jailed Ghislaine Maxwell. Um, and how he really well, we'll get to a lot of the different things he did, but the way he caught my attention because he apparently had developed some kind of a monopoly on how scientific research is peer reviewed, how the scientific journals how they conduct this review, and basically what gets published, what gets researched, and it's a pretty fascinating story. Um, I think I want to start with that aspect of Maxwell because I think it's very important. I first found out or noticed that there was a big problem with peer review in 2009. The ClimateGate emails dropped, and what that was is somebody leaked or whistle blew thousands of emails from the University of East Anglia, the climate research center there, and what you saw was scientists like Michael Mann and Phil Jones, world renowned or very famous quote unquote climate scientists, how they were bastardizing the peer review process. And we had their emails. They're saying, well, this person disagrees with this. Let's make sure he never gets peer reviewed or we make sure they never get published. And there was a really incestual monopoly on what scientific thought was going to be released to the public. And that's just not how science is supposed to be. So this came on my radar back in 2009. I've always had the issues. And then when COVID came around, when you saw all the garbage that was getting published in, supposedly um, reliable journals like what was the one, the Lancet, and they had started having to recall their own articles because it was just pure garbage, and they were pushing propaganda from the World Health Organization and other government agencies. And it's if you really start to understand just how pervasive this problem is, it's ruined what science actually is, and it's turned it into propaganda in many ways. And scientists have been lamenting this for a long time. But at the end of the day, if you don't get your job unless you get published or are reviewing people in your field, and who controls who gets reviewed, and that's unfortunately it turns out to be Robert Maxwell. So, Colonel, who is Robert Maxwell?
Maxwell is a very interesting figure in the research that I've done with Operation Gladio, because, originally born in what was at the time part of the Soviet Union. So they trace his roots to being part of they associate him with the Russian mafia, basically. And he goes on to become part of Mossad. He also works with the CIA. He's involved in money laundering. He's involved in the sale of Promise software, which was stolen by the United States government and given to the CIA and to Mossad for the purpose of creating backdoor access to money laundering activities so they could mask their money laundering but detect others to use as blackmail. So he has been up to his eyeballs in nefarious everythings under the guise of having, as you just referenced, bought major media publications throughout the UK and created this media empire. To me, that's most relevant when you realize who owns the media empires in the United States, in Israel, and in Germany. They are all set up as a microcosm of Robert Maxwell. He is literally kind of like a lighthouse in the harbor. Look at me. And everything that's evolves around him that we will talk about today is replicated repeatedly throughout the entire international syndicate, as I call it.
And we get, Operation Mockingbird. That's The Mockingbird meeting
Exactly.
in America, it's right there.
Yeah.
So this story, the chapter of the story that I want to focus on here starts in 1946. Robert Maxwell is 23 years old and he's working in Berlin as an intelligence officer. This is post World War II. You have all the German scientists, having been Operation Paperclip to America and other places, and we're about to hit a scientific boom in the world. Science is about to change. You have real top scientists in England like Alexander Fleming, who invented penicillin, and a guy named Charles Galton Darwin, the grandson of Charles Darwin, who's an interesting name. We'll get to him one of these days. They were really concerned that British science was world class, but their publishing was dismal. And it was true. You had to. It's one thing to do the science; the other is how do you communicate it to other scientists in the rest of the world. So the government solution was to pair a venerable British publishing house called Butterworth's with the renowned German publisher Springer, so they could draw on the latter's expertise. The Butterworth directors were ex-British intelligence officers, and so they ended up hiring Maxwell to help manage the company. And there's another ex-spook they hired by the name of Paul Rosbad, who was a metallurgist who spent the war passing Nazi nuclear secrets to the British through the French and Dutch resistance. So he's the science editor, and Maxwell's in there to manage the business. These guys are a partnership. They didn't last long. Rosebud would leave the firm about 7 or 8 years later because he found Maxwell to be rather an unsavory character.
No kidding.
About 5 years into that, Maxwell pays about £13,000 and buys a controlling interest in the company. And him and Rosebud took it and run. He calls the new venture the Pergamon Press, and it's an interesting choice of names, the Pergamon Press, because Pergamon was an ancient Turkish city that was known for human sacrifices to Luce and Baal.
Exactly.
There's also something in the Bible, or biblical stories about how Jesus wrote letters to Pergamon, basically warning them against their sexual depravity. And of course, the city of Pergamon, or the kingdom of Pergamon, it was at the time, all their coins had snakes on there as a symbol. So it's an interesting choice of names for his company. I thought it was
totally on purpose.
Well, the timing couldn't have been better for him to get involved in this. Like I said, science is about to explode. You familiar with Vannevar Bush?
No.
Vannevar Bush would basically, he was the president of the Carnegie Institution in Washington, science, and we know the Carnegies are knee deep in everything the Rockefellers did. He would be the head of the U.S. Office of Scientific Research and Development in World War II, and he was the early administrator of the Manhattan Project. Also, he was the founder of a company that came to be known as Raytheon.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. He just had a real famous quote. He said, "Science has been in the wings. It should be brought to the center of the stage, for it lies much in our hope for the future." So Vannevar Bush was really pushing the science post-World War II. And along comes Maxwell to help publish the science or help take it over. Interesting thing happens in 1957. Sputnik gets launched by the Russians, and the Western scientists are scrambling to catch up with Russia and find all this research. And they found out that, Maxwell had already negotiated an exclusive English language deal to publish the Russian Academy of Sciences journal earlier in the decade. So you mentioned his Russian mafia background. Well, he apparently kept those Russian contacts.
He most definitely did.
Yeah. So he basically, it's that part of the story I think is fascinating, and I want to read more about it. But so by 1959, Pergamon is publishing about 40 journals, scientific journals, and about 6 years later, published about 150. And the way he went about it's interesting. Any type of field of science, Maxwell would show up at the conferences and he'd wine and dine these scientists, and he'd create a new journal because you had to have a journal if you're going to have a field of science. And he'd get some renowned academic to become the head of that. And through that, Maxwell would be able to control the funding and the research itself.
I was going to say, let me clarify that. You have to have a journal so you can control the science.
That's exactly right. And the peer review, this quote unquote peer review process, it hasn't always been that way. Science used to be, pretty pure. Yeah, you put your idea
Oh,
out
it's a
there.
form of control.
Yeah, yeah. Well, they bastardize it. Um, really fun. I'm jumping ahead here, but it's good to talk about control. Maxwell also would buy McGraw-Hill, which is a publisher of our textbooks in 1989, and
Yes,
so that's everything our kids are learning from is by a
correct.
company that Maxwell had purchased and likely
Control
corrected. Um, the rest of the business model is interesting. So most scientific research gets its funding where?
from the government.
Exactly. Government. Sometimes you get NGOs and foundations. It's mostly from the government. So you throw this government money at some research. Scientists, if they want to push forward their career, they basically get judged by how often you publish and also how often you review. Yep, it's like statistics on the back of a baseball card. That's what goes on your resume.
Correct.
How much have you published? And then that's how they control. If you
Not
can't get,
unlike professors.
yeah, it's exactly right. It's and it's not just pure science. I mean, it's the soft sciences, the hard sciences, the made up sciences like climate science, all of that stuff. It's the exact same pattern. So the government funds it. Pergamon will turn around and create a journal and control what gets put in it. Then Pergamon turns around and sells the academic journals to universities who have no choice but to buy them. It's an absolute monopoly. And who funds the universities? It's the government again.
Right.
The government funds the research. Pergamon takes a cut, it gets a commission to put the research back to the universities. And that's the system that Maxwell built. And it's an incredible profit margin.
And it comes back to the control as far as I'm concerned too, because if you control the science, you can create the fake science like climate. But you couldn't do climate if you didn't already control the system because it doesn't stand on its own.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But my mind kind of explodes when you think about just how much control of so much that the implications of this and how much this scheme alone, not to mention some of the other stuff we're going to talk about with Maxwell, how much this scheme has changed so many aspects of the world and
Correct.
still does to this very day. And I say to this very day, Maxwell's gone now, but his company was purchased by a Dutch firm called Elsevier. Elsevier now controls somewhere around 45% of all peer-reviewed journals, scientific journals. One Dutch company, and it's got a very interesting history of its own. I'm about halfway through researching that. It's they do billions a year in profits, and the profit margins are some of the best, one of the most profitable companies in the world. Just basically selling research back to universities. There is a pushback in the field. Uh, we'll see how far we'll see how that goes. I mean, obviously, peer review in the medical journals have got a big black eye during the COVID in 2020, and of course, we're seeing more and more of that, especially in Europe. You're getting a lot of revelations lately of medical journals are having to pull faulty research, and they're getting chastised or worse for keeping other research out of the publication. And I think that's the omission that's just as bad.
Well, in the climate gate with the leaked emails, exposed a lot of the chicanery too.
Mm. And to this day, interesting side note on that is Michael Mann is so we just finished week 2 of his slander trial, or what is it, slander or libel he has against Mark Stein, and that's Michael Mann's being funded by some huge left wing donors. He's not paying a penny. That came out in the trial, but I've been listening to as much of that as I could these last 2 weeks. And Mark Stein is a brilliant British wit, and he's
Right.
just it's very entertaining to hear his opening speech. I may put that on our show tomorrow night just for 5 minutes of it. Um, but really, what it comes down to is, Michael Mann published the hockey stick theory,
Yeah.
and journalists like scientists like Stephen McIntyre and Ross McKittrick, Canadians both, went back and looked into his data and said, no, you could be anything numbers you threw into your model would have looked like a hockey stick. It is fraudulent, and it was. They tried to hide a bunch of. They called Mike's came out in the ClimateGate emails about Mike's nature trick and how you could
Exactly.
You hide the decline, is the famous quote in an email. That's what this trial is all about, because Mark Stein called him out, and he's trying to sue uh, Michael Mann for defamation, or Michael Mann's trying to sue Mark Stein for defamation.
Right.
Michael Mann is more politician than he will ever be a scientist. And I'll give you a great example. When I lived in California, there was a local paper, maybe had a subscription of maybe 3 or 4,000 people, called the Del Mar Register. And somebody wrote a letter to the editor, complaining about, basically calling the whole climate hysteria a hoax or overstated. Michael Mann, who's supposed to be this world-renowned scientist, wrote a letter to the editor the following week that got published, and a local 3,000 subscriber fish wrap wrote like paragraphs defending himself. So all he cared about was the image and nothing about the science. He didn't. I thought that anecdote it's always cracked me up that he would pay attention to such a small publication.
But they can't allow any piece of their lie to be exposed. And it doesn't matter. I found that like in the Laurel Canyon research that I did. If any one person pops their head up with any logical truth, they have to be beat. They have to be made an example of.
Yeah, it's whack-a-mole.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's because the whole thing's built on lies. The whole facade comes crumbling down.
Correct.
You can do the same thing when you're talking about this whole woke culture war. They can't be wrong about anything, because the whole ball of yarn unravels if you can just take apart any of it. And anyways, let's go back to Maxwell, because that's one heck of a lot of influence just on the scientific publishing. But there's so much more to Maxwell, and you're probably better. You're probably better at leading this part of it. So I'll turn it over to you.
Well, my fascination with Maxwell came not only from his Russian mafia roots. You find very few people that traverse multiple intel agencies. So he affiliates while he's building his media empire with MI6 and MI5 in Britain. He also, because of his work in Germany, was affiliated with the Galen Empire, which became the BND, which is their current CIA. So he had ends there. And that's at a critical moment when they were transitioning from Hitler's intel apparatus, which Galen ran, to West Germany's intel apparatus, which Galen ran. And they created, in the middle of those two transitions, Operation Gladio. And Robert Maxwell around the world falls into several aspects of the funding, intelligence, software used in Operation Gladio, and just the entire infrastructure of it. So he touches the UK, Germany, Mossad, and the CIA. There's very few people that has inside connections to all of those intelligence agencies. And that's just one facet, because he's intimately involved in the selling of the Promise, spelt Promise without an E, software that was stolen by the United States government for the detection of money laundering across the world. Eventually Mossad gets a copy of it and the CIA gets a copy of it. Both of them build backdoors into the software, which gives them independent visibility into tracking money laundering. So not only is Robert Maxwell now in charge of this massive media apparatus, he also is very intimately aware of who's money laundering, who's not. And Mossad physically hires him to go throughout the world and sell Promise software to countries. So he's intimately involved in the intel, and he's going on his intel infrastructure credibility, if you will, to heads of state saying, hey, we've got this capability. Once they installed that software, Every single thing they did transactionally, money-wise, was visible to both the CIA and Mossad.
Yeah, and as someone who's worked for the big banks most of my previous career, we have to fill out suspicious activity reports anytime, for some of the most routine things. But it's there's a reason Hunter Biden got flagged like 35 times. You got to work really hard to get flagged once. You've got to be doing something really bad when you're doing it 35 times. I
But
wanted to touch on
but imagine having the capability to hide it.
yes, or to see what other people are seeing, or to know that it's what they're seeing, who's getting caught or who's about to get caught, so you can warn your
Or
people.
blackmail.
Oh, there you go. I didn't even think of that one. Yeah, that's pretty insidious. The timing of all this stuff happening is interesting. And I think it's worth noting that the United States, prior to World War II, never had intelligence agencies during peacetime. They had to develop one on code breakers on the fly in World War One. And then when World War II broke out, they had to they went and grabbed Wild Bill Donovan to create the OSS, which eventually would give birth to the CIA in 1947. And how did they learn what to do? Well, they worked right side by side with the British, because British has had great intelligence for centuries. I mean, they invented this whole concept, the MI6 and MI5. And the third part of that, of course, is when is Israel formed as a country? That's 1947, 48. And of course, they had to have intelligence agencies. And who would they learn it from?
Well, let me throw a monkey wrench in that. Wild Bill Donovan had a very good idea of how intelligence works, and so did most of all the governments, because you will fast forward to William Colby's famous quote, "There's no one that had a better intelligence apparatus than the Vatican." They had and utilized, to include Wild Bill Donovan, the Catholic Church for a massive intelligence operation.
And they used a lot of law firms like Sullivan and Cromwell was famous for that.
And it's interesting that you say that, because that's the reason why I coined that phrase international syndicate, because every industrialist had their own spy network. Every bank, every government, even though we didn't have the formal OSS, we did have the Army counterintelligence capability in a very small, uh, unrefined way. But it was all done in the private world, all the private entities. The transition after World War II, this is such a big foot stomp for me, is that we took every element of the industrialists, the mafia, and the mafia, it had some of the best intelligence capability. They knew everything about everything going on, and that's been, hundreds of years. So they took every aspect of that and put it in the CIA. That is the capability of the CIA. They took what was criminally illegal to do, that had been done for 100 years, and embedded it in the government and gave it a stamp that says national security on it, so you can never question them on anything.
Yeah, and we're seeing that play out today. They go to testify in front of Congress, and they just say, "No, it's national security. We can't tell you."
Correct.
And there's no
Every
oversight.
criminal element.
Yeah. Fun little side note on the history of intelligence in the U.S. I like this little story. Our first real official intelligence agency was the Office of Naval Intelligence in the
Oh, yeah.
1870s. It's created because other countries in the world had been creating a weapon of mass destruction that they wanted to find out about and see if they could copy. That weapon of mass destruction was called a battleship. And so the Navy created an intelligence arm to go out and find out what these battleships, how they were made, and how to counter them.
Well, and obviously they had the best cover too, because they ported everywhere. So the Navy was the only capability at the time that we had that had a worldwide reach. And that was true with England and a lot of the empires, because they traveled all over the world, and they were the best collection of the intelligence.
Well, yeah, because these maritime empires, they
Correct.
were they became maritime empires because of trade. And when you trade in ports, when you get to a port, you have to have intelligence. There's an
Correct.
underworld in every port city in the world.
Correct.
And go back to the law firms. Sullivan and Cromwell was doing this for U.S. multinational corporations like U.S. Fruit. That's why they were the ones who were on the ground in Panama when they annexed Panama from Colombia for the sole purpose of creating the Panama Canal so United Fruit
Correct.
could save some money on shipping.
Correct.
And of course, when you say Sullivan and Cromwell, it has to be pointed out that both the Dulles brothers were alumni of Sullivan and Cromwell.
And there's no coincidence that Dulles was instrumental in setting up the CIA, because he had been doing it on the industrial side of the international syndicate for decades at that point.
Yeah, him and his brother were both sitting at the table in Versailles in 1919
Correct.
for the peace treaty. Yeah, the Treaty of Versailles.
And his brother was him in the Asian theater. Alan Dulles did it in the European theater. His brother did it in the Asian theater.
I've got a great book I'm almost finished with called The Old Boys that talks about that period in Versailles and really how the Dulles brothers. I'll have to send you a copy of that. It's a really good book. We'll have to. God, it's one we could almost do a book review on it like you do on your channel all the time. It's really that
That'd
good.
be awesome.
It really gets into the real psychiatry, whatever. The whole background of Dulles as a young man, which you can't read anywhere else. So it's a well done book.
Awesome.
I will
look forward to
recommend
it.
that one. All right, let's come back to our friend Maxwell. So what else is he into? Given all this background information, and he's already wielding more power than any human being should ever have just with the publishing. But let's go deeper into the software, because you touched on that when we talked earlier.
So the software aspect of what he began, and also I would say, although he was murdered, although they call it a suicide, in 1991, if you research into his children, they basically took segments of Maxwell and recreated them. They are literally, if you combine them all, a sitting Robert Maxwell here today. Because on the software side, Isabel and Christine, his twins, has worked closely with Bill Gates, Cisco, every name brand software that you can imagine. And they all are Christine actually is the CEO doing this of a Israeli firm that's tied to Unit 8200, which is their basically like their DARPA, their NSA, their all of that tied into one. So still today, they are building software with back doors to them. And that all started with Robert Maxwell. They are literally his living capability. So every piece of Microsoft software, every piece of the Cisco mainframe has embedded in it things that were created by an Israeli firm. And what's important to me about that is everything in the United States government is ran off of Microsoft.
Yeah, that's a little frightening. I think he said something really important. This is not a past tense story. This is going on today, to this day.
Correct.
33 years after his 32 after Maxwell's death, his legacy lives on, and it's going on every single day.
And Jess Lane was a partner in the original software company that the two sisters created. Now, you have to tie that in with their visits to the White House. Something that a lot of people don't know is Jeffrey Epstein was part of, as well as Jess Lane, was part of a group called Mega Group. Mega Group was made up of Wexner, the mafia-tied guy from Detroit, whose name's escaping me at the minute. And there's a whole bunch of them in this group called Mega Group. Mega Group funded the Center for Political Leadership or Public Leadership at Harvard, which is why Jeffrey Epstein hung out at Harvard, as well as Jess Lane. This Mega Group funded the renovation of the White House. That's important. And Robert Maxwell was involved in Mega Group too. So Robert Maxwell, after he does all of his media and big conglomeration in London, he decides he's going to splash down in New York City. And he wants to be the golden boy of New York City. So he's in with the Mega Group members. He's throwing parties. He's everywhere. He wants to be the golden boy.
Yeah, he's competing with Rupert Murdoch for the media empire.
Yes.
In the 80s.
Yes. He encourages Ghislaine Maxwell to hook up with JFK Jr. She's at all of the Kennedy things. He views Kennedys as our royal family, and he wanted her in there big time. So all of this is going on. This mega group funds the renovation through donations of the White House. Now, think about that for just a second. Every single entity Jeffrey Epstein owned was renovated. And how is it renovated? With cameras and spy equipment via Robert Maxwell legacy, right? So they fund the renovation of the White House. Now, we all know through Linda. This would have been in Clinton took office in 92. So it's around the 93, 94 timeframe. And now, because Robert Maxwell got knocked off in 91. So around the 94 timeframe, this legacy group of Mega Group funds this renovation. Linda Tripp told us that she knew, this got lost in the whole blue dress garbage, that she knew Israel was spying on the White House. And that's the reason why she came forward with the Monica Lewinsky, who happens to be Jewish as well, exposure of the blue dress incident. So how did Israel know about what was going on in the Oval Office after the renovation? They were spying on the White House. That's crazy.
It is.
That's all a fallout of Robert Maxwell and what he was involved in. I also have made this is purely speculation from my point of view, but this is how this works. That picture of Bill Clinton in the blue dress, for any of your audience that are hunters, they understand what a trophy buck is. That's Israel's trophy buck. That picture was the capture of the United States president in the blue dress.
That is interesting. I'm looking up something on Monica Lewinsky because she has an interesting connection through her education. I'll see if I can find it. I just stumbled upon it recently. I thought I saw that she was either a Rhodes Scholar or did one of the other schools in London. She spent some time at that's connected to a lot of shenanigans. But I
like
don't find that in my
School
notes.
of Economics.
That might have been it.
Yeah, I'm almost sure it is.
Yeah, I did something I was reading just recently. And interesting enough,
all seem to have that connection.
Yeah, and Lewinsky's mother, just coincidentally, I don't think this is actually connected, but it's funny. It actually lived at the Watergate complex. So
yes,
yeah, I don't know if that has anything to do with anything or not, or if that's just a coincidence.
But we know that there's a building right behind the Watergate complex that came out during the Nixon administration. That at the Watergate, the DNC was running a blackmail scheme of hookers at the Watergate, and the building right behind it had rooms there as well, much like the Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell had a very similar, and I think it was like 301 something complex where the Miss Sweden was kept, that Anderson, that spelt like the Swedish way of spelling Anderson. There was a whole bunch of the famous models that Jeffrey Epstein was running through his blackmail scheme that was all kept at a location. The DNC had the exact same thing associated with the Watergate. VIP that came in, they would run hookers or these young women into the Watergate Hotel as part of their operation. And that got exposed during Watergate.
Yeah, I did a show not long ago talking about CIA's relationship with the JFK assassination and the Watergate break-in. I think how it was investigated and covered, it's been a bit of a whitewash. We know who led the Watergate break-in was CIA. The same
Correct.
guy was also in Dallas, Texas in 1963. He was also in Miami during the Cuban Missile, not the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Bay of Pigs.
Correct.
So the connections are, interesting. There's a part of me that I could accept an argument that Nixon was absolutely framed by his own intelligence agencies.
I know how you can come to that conclusion, and that kind of was my going in position. But once you understand how dirty Nixon is, you have to question how and why he was framed. Did he come to the end of his usefulness, or did he have second guesses? Because, and the reason why I say that is Nixon was instrumental in setting up Operation Gladio as Eisenhower's vice president. He's the one that made the trips. He's the one that was intimately involved in setting up many of the networks with a very hands-on approach to it.
Well, he was CFR. He was CFR from the 1950s.
Yes, but I mean, he is an instrument, an instrumental figure in Operation Gladio as the vice president in working with the CIA in the establishment of Gladio. He also, in 1972, launched his war on drugs, which wasn't a war on drugs at all. It was the taking out of the Corsican mafia to realign it all with the Sicilian mafia, which was under the control of the CIA. He did not like the fact that the Corsican mafia had the monopoly on the poppy coming from Vietnam. So he worked with others in the Gladio network inside of France to eliminate and I mean, they killed like over 350 Corsican mafia, like hit style assassinations that was coordinated by Nixon to shift the entire drug trade coming out of Vietnam to the Sicilian mafia because the CIA controlled them.
I guess well, I was going to say, one of the things when you get, the argument that the CIA took out Nixon was that Nixon was going to end the war in Vietnam and dry up their poppy trade. And that's the argument. And I found it to be reasonable, but I think you've actually.
I don't think that's reasonable at all.
Yeah, I think the preponderance of evidence suggests that you're correct.
Yeah.
But the question is, why was Lincoln allowed to be taken down? I mean, the Washington Post, Woodward and Bernstein were frauds. We found out who Deep Throat was later, and that was intelligence.
So there are other aspects of that could probably be its own show. But there are other aspects of that. And in some cases, just like with Maxwell was very intricately involved in all of this, almost to the point where he knew too much. And that oftentimes happens when the same thing with Ferdinand Marcos. Marcos was corrupt for the entire time. When Reagan went to him and asked for some of that Golden Lily gold and for his rainbow dollars, and he told him no, he had to be gone. And they basically told him, you've got like 5 minutes to pack your bags. We're sending a helicopter and you're out. And he was out. He was taken to Hawaii and tried. So that's literally how this operation works. Same thing with Maxwell. He was fine. He's doing all of this great intel work until the day he wasn't.
Yeah, and who gets to call that shot? Who do you think?
So I found it completely fascinating. Now, something that I just want you, because you're such a great researcher, to stick in your mind is the year 1991. The whole world seemed to change. That's the year Maxwell was taken out. 1991 is the year that Gladio was exposed in Italy for the first time. It actually got exposed in August initially of 1990. The investigation was done and the real revelations came out in 1991. I believe that the invasion of Iraq was set up to obfuscate the revealing of Operation Gladio in the Western media. And because it was completely staged as well. So Maxwell's boat is docked off of the Canary Islands when he's taken out. Now, let me explain the significance of the Canary Islands. Operation Gladio had some very specific training sites. Sardinia was one of them. The Canary Islands is another one. And off the coast of Portugal was another one. That's not to mention Fort Bragg and Fort Benning and several that was in the United States. But the Canary Islands had both SOE, which was the British version of MI6 trainers. The SAS was there. We had special forces there. Scorzini was there. The Black Prince from Italy that was in charge of the training of Gladio operators throughout Italy was there. They had a huge school for Gladio operators in the Canary Islands. One of their specialties is the underwater scuba thing. It would have been very easy for them to climb on that boat, kill him, and do away with him. And I don't think it's a coincidence that he was docked off of the Canary Islands.
Okay.
I don't have that. That is a conclusion that I've made my own. I don't have, the guy's name of the scuba diver that climbed up on his boat, but it definitely makes you wonder, because that is where all of the water activities happened, was at the Canary. They had different specialties at different locations. Like we had the explosive one just north of the Mexican border in the state of Texas that Gladio operators were sent to for explosive training. Each one of them had very specific training. The snipers were all sent to Sardinia. They also did kidnapping there. And if you go back and you start searching on Sardinia and kidnapping, it will blow your mind, because what they do in these training locations is they use real people to train. So that's what I'm thinking happened. If they're using real people and they have people docked off of the Canary Islands that they need to have taken out, well, boom.
And Maxwell should have known. I mean, would have known most of that. And
he was sent there for a very specific reason. And my understanding is why he went there is he was meeting somebody. Also, who's the guy that just came up? Shoot. Oh, this will come to me in a second. In Las Vegas, the guy that supported Trump, what's his name? The Jewish guy that has the casinos.
Is it Abel? No, that's
yes, yeah, the Adelson.
Yeah, Sidney
Okay.
Adelson.
All right. So you remember the recent story about his chief of security, which was Mossad, working with the Spanish guy. What was that story? There was a Spanish guy that, oh shoot, that Spanish guy was a Gladio operator, and he was just accused of murdering somebody. And that guy, there's documented in one of these Gladio books where he spent time in the Canary Islands and had contact with Robert Maxwell. So it's very conceivable that, because you're exactly right. So he knows this is going on. Maxwell could have been asked to come there as part of some operation as a setup. But that Spanish guy was key to a very recent event that, when I started looking into his background, his name comes up in the Spanish Gladio.
I'm going to share a screen with you real quick, because there's a story that I'd had bookmarked, and you just touched on it, even though I wasn't planning on even going there. But I'll just read the headline to you. You should be able to see that now. The court files expose Sheldon Adelson's security team in U.S. spying on Assange. An exclusive.
That's it. Okay, so Yes, the Spanish guy that had gotten the security from the Ecuador, he was given a contract from Ecuador to run the Ecuadorian in Britain's. That's it. That's the story. That Spanish guy that owned that security company, it was a private security company from Spain. That guy is a Gladio operator. And he was assigned, he's the guy they were going to use to assassinate Assange.
Okay.
That's the guy. He was trained by Gladio.
Well, that doesn't come as a shock at all. Yeah, I'd had that story on my radar to dig into deeper, but you filled
I
in
already did it. Yeah.
Missing connections.
Yeah. So he was hired by the president of Ecuador to guard his kids, and his company was given the contract to provide security at the Ecuadorian. And he had a partner. The partner became the whistleblower in Spain, ratting this guy out, saying he wasn't doing anything that he was supposed to be doing. And he's the one that was trying to assassinate Assange.
Yeah, well, they
And that guy is a Gladio guy.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder how Assange is actually still alive to this day. For all the people he's got to have one heck of a dead man switch to have been able to survive that long.
Well, but I say the same thing about Trump. With all of the different soft coup attempts, not physical, you have to assume there's been physical, but they've staged 3 soft coup attempts against him. And by they, I mean CIA. CIA was involved in the first one that started in 2016 with the FBI. And some people have to also understand this. Just because somebody's carrying the label of FBI doesn't mean they're actually FBI. The CIA becomes FBI. They become DEA. They become military officers at a flip of a switch.
Peter Strzok was working for the FBI and he was CIA all the way.
Thank you. So the CIA soft couped him in 2000, the beginning of 2017 when he first took office, but it started building in 2016. They also did the Ukrainian phone call, and they also did January 6th. So there's 3 soft coups, all basically Gladio operations, where you have the CIA that's infiltrating the January 6th and causing the havoc. And people keep blaming the FBI, but and I'm not saying they're not dirty as well, but the vested interest of this international syndicate to not have Trump around orchestrated 3 soft coups, and there's no way that you can get around. Every one of them had a CIA asset. That Eric Charamella guy that was in the Ukraine phone call, every single one of them was basically a Gladio operation soft coup.
Yeah, and the topic that I want to talk about the next time we do a show, hopefully in the next few days, we'll talk about why they need Trump gone so bad. And I'm going to tell you one of the major reasons is because of these trade deals that Trump gets in a way with. And just to foreshadow what we're going to talk about is every single one of these trade deals, the vast majority of it are made up with what's called a ISDS agreement, which is an investor state dispute settlement that allows multinational corporations to sue host countries in an international court of 3 arbiters, totally outside of your sovereign laws, and there is no appeal process. So we're going to that's foreshadowing our next conversation. I want to go into that deeper because that is the white collar version of Gladio.
Well, it's the international syndicate. The international syndicate runs Gladio. Gladio just happens to be the military, the private military, if you will, of the international syndicate. The international syndicate uses Gladio in order to infiltrate countries. That's just the nuts and bolts of it. But what I found interesting in my research is Churchill, as I've pointed out several times, ran basically the commerce department of England before he became the prime minister. The trade is everything. Ron Brown ran the commerce. If you go back and you look at every secretary that's been the commerce secretary under the trade aspects, and those that work in the State Department working on the trade aspect, they all have the exact same pedigree. Most of them have ran the DNC at some point. Ron Brown obviously was murdered as well in a very Gladio-esque fashion, assassinated. And He is the one that worked all of the deals to sell all of our technology to China via L'Oreal, Loral, and all of these other companies. The companies have been fined, like L'Oreal was fined $20 million for the illegal sell, but Ron Brown facilitated it. You are absolutely right. Trade is like the hugest big deal. But you already mentioned United Fruit, where Rockefeller and the International Syndicate and a lot of Intel, United Front was a CIA front company. And
That's
they went
DuPont.
into,
That's DuPont family, who were
yes,
longtime partners of the Bush family and the
100%.
rest of the Brown brothers Harriman cabal.
Yes. So they go into Guatemala. They own 42% of the land for this fruit company. They pay not a single penny to the Guatemalan government in tax revenue. They have destroyed Guatemala. They use Guatemalans as slaves. And the first time Guatemala elects a president that stands up to the United Front, he's gladioed. All of the land is taken back, and Guatemala is still the shithole that Trump said it was.
I will
Um,
save some of that for the next show,
yeah,
because there's a whole lot there. I wanted just to touch on Julian Assange, just to finish this up. Julian Assange has to be taken out because he's the one person that has proof of where the quote unquote Russia hack of the DNC headquarters in 2015 was.
100%.
If you pull that string and let it be known that it was not an external hack, which we've never seen any evidence of, and it's really interesting, who actually investigated those servers? Well, it wasn't the FBI, as you'd think. No, it was a company called CrowdStrike. Well, CrowdStrike is owned and run by two main people. One of them is Dmitry Alperovich, who's Ukrainian, who sits on the Atlantic Council and is a huge Clinton supporter. But there's also, and I'm going to forget his name, but the guy used to be a lieutenant working under James Comey and Bob Mueller in the FBI as the other guy at CrowdStrike. I'll get
I
his
don't,
name. I know
yeah,
his name. I'll get it momentarily. That's who looked at the DNC servers. So that's ugly to start with. And Assange actually has the proof of who gave him, those emails. If that's part of the story blows up, then the entire predicate for spying on Donald Trump's campaign blows up. The entire Russia narrative, 2 years of investigation, breaking all kinds of rules, abuse of FISA to spy on U.S. citizens. I mean, I'll keep going. The whole thing unravels if Assange gets to talk.
correct.
And that's why a lot of people will say that's why Seth Rich is no longer with us. And I
100%.
yeah, and there's some stuff that's been leaked out recently about Seth Rich and his laptop and how the FBI actually had stuff they've never revealed. So, and it was brought up the other day. I was doing a show with my friend Ron Partain, and we were talking about El Salvador and how they've suspended their constitution to fight the drug cartels, or the MS-13. And Ron brings up the fact that the two people that did take out Seth Rich were both MS-13, and they were both taken out themselves within weeks afterwards.
Correct.
Dead men tell no tales.
Correct. Which is a classic Gladio operation. I mean, that's what they do. They assign them a mission, and then when they've fulfilled their mission, they're gone. But I also believe very much that the whole cartel system, that again, it's names like they created the name Color Revolution because they don't want us associating the taking out of current heads of state with Gladio. It's the exact same thing. You can't change the name without it's kind of obfuscating the actual history of the entire operation. The same thing with MS-13. You can say that, oh, they're only here because of the cartel and the open border and all that other stuff. But if you peel that onion back, you find out that the entire cartel network was set up and funded by the CIA. So you're not talking apples and oranges. You're really just talking oranges.
And just to top it off, who gets to call these shots? And you call it international syndicate. It's a really good term. I've always called it a global game. It's a cabal. And that's what these really are. What I call it is the cartel. And it operates just like a classic cartel exists for two reasons. You maximize your own profit, but you also, more importantly, eliminate your competition. That's what cartels exist to do. But who calls these shots in this syndicate or this cartel? It's a global Game of Thrones. There's a bunch of different interests, and there's no one person that sits on the throne and says thumbs up or thumbs down in the arena. You've got these organizations like the Council of Foreign Relations. You've got people like the Atlantic Council we just mentioned. There's these organizations, and a lot of them are transatlantic. It's England and American
I
influence.
call them international.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, should we give this one a wrap, or is there anything else we want to close with?
I think that's it.
Why don't you tell the people on my channel where they can find you?
I'm on Twitter, I'm on Substack, I'm on Truth Social, I'm on Rumble at the Colonel's Corner on Rumble, and everywhere else it's either Colonel Towner or Colonel Towner-Watkins.
Very good. And you can find me on Rumble at war_hamster, where this video will be. I am on Twitter at war_hamster1776. Make sure you look for the 1776, because there's another person that uses a different spelling of war hamster, and his opinions aren't that much different from me. But I don't dislike the guy by any stretch. I just wish he had a different name. And you can get me on True Social at war_hamster. And for the record, I was on Twitter first, so he's the copycat. But and you'll be seeing me on Substack soon, and I'll be making more noise, and looking forward to doing more shows in the near future. Colonel, thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.